So in my talk, I think I suspect that I would be able to give a different reading of the real. That reading is not the subject of my talk immediately, but in literature on Orientalism in France, Henri is closely compared with Vedanta, or compared to Vedanta. And in Henrian interpretations of Carlo Canullo, who is the Italian philosopher, she was able to trace, I think, clearly evident continuity between Henri's investigations of flesh in material phenomenology and his Christian writings, which are basically writings in theology of flesh. And in this interpretive tradition, I think that Henri will be viewed as a monist. And I also believe that one of his agendas was development of constitutive phenomenology out of his understanding of flesh. So the central thesis of this approach will be that intentionality masks flesh. It's not that flesh is invisible by itself, but in a manner similar to Aristotelian hierarchies, in which form masks fully. In Henri, intentionality masks appearance of flesh, which is very similar to how Husserl interprets primal impression, but in Henri, flesh is active, which creates a possibility for phenomenology, which would be non-intentional. And he also criticized Merleau-Ponty, he criticized Husserl's reduction. So in this talk, I will, in a sense, try to, I marry, actually, Henrian phenomenology of flesh with Husserl's constitutive phenomenology. And I do so not a prioristically, but based on the experience and accounts that one can find in religious texts, and also in second-person accounts of people with whom I had a chance to communicate, and also in first-person reflection. So the plan of my talk is as follows. First, I'll try to illumine Husserlian sources of my approach. Then I will talk about embodied inwardness as foundation in provinces of religious meaning, in which, and here I'm heavily relying on your concept, Mike. Then I'll talk about phenomenology, descriptive phenomenology of embodied inwardness, and then try to distinguish inwardness, embodied inwardness, as a region of consciousness. Then I'll talk about how psychic hierarchies appear differently in inwardness in contrast with how they're usually superimposed on the body. And then, time permitting, I'll touch on cognition of non-objects in embodied inwardness, and in connection with it, how inwardness, the kind of transcendences that can be traced within embodied inwardness. So Husserlian sources. In Grant's Probleme, Husserl says, is and how is religious experience constituted? Does religious experience as self-giving really exist? And how does it look in pure self-giving? What is its content? That would be pure religion as the content of a universal religious experience and of a religious faith that proves itself through experience. There is also the following quotation in Grant's Probleme, though I believe it comes from one of Husserl's letters, and I didn't take a note of which letter that is. But Sova, I believe, cites it in the introduction to Grant's Probleme. And Husserl says, my life's work is to make philosophy from below. That's what I strive for incessantly, from below up to the heights. So that's, of course, pointing out to passive synthesis as the ground of the constitutive process, and then this hierarchies of constitution, building upward from the data of passive synthesis, constitution of time consciousness. Now, again, I unfortunately didn't pay attention to chronology of these two statements, but I believe that reflections on religious experience is something that Husserl carried through his whole life, and you can find it in different areas of his body of work. And the fact that he mentions evidence so overtly with regard to religious experience makes me think that even in transcendental phenomenological understanding of consciousness, the idea of evidence is still alive and well. And except for that, the concept of truth, the concept of fulfillment, which will be constitutive components of this intuition of evidence, that part changes from more abstract and more straightforward maybe understanding of this to much more nuance in terms of the quality of evidence. But evidence is central, and then this allows me to build my approach on the analysis of evidence. So I use constitutive phenomenology as a tool which helps to understand experience not just in terms of its content, but in terms of its genetics. And taking experience all the way down back to evidence on which the constitution of experience is built helps to place experience in a larger picture, that of the unified metaphysics of the world. So if you know the evidence and if you can infer what are the sources of evidence, then here is the bridge to metaphysics. Thus, in the analysis of experience, I take it back regressively to passive synthesis and then attempt to trace the transcendental aspect in evidence from synthesis. And, you know, considerable part of Husserl's work is work with a priori. And, but a priori are not really theoretical. They are embedded in experience, or they were embedded in experience, and then a priori emerges as the result of accumulated knowledge of experience, sedimented knowledge. And a priori shows conceptual limitation in regard to experience that went into generatively into constituting these a prioris. And so when a priori shows its conceptual limitation, one has to go back to lived experience and work of the phenomenological description. The problem with the religious experience is, and especially with experience of embodied inwardness, is that experience of inwardness is not commonly shared. One has to practice inwardness or be lucky to run into inwardness at a certain point in one's life. But there are models of religious consciousness that involve constitutive, static, and genetic phenomenology, and which models can be applied to position inwardness in the picture of consciousness as such. So one of these models comes from Flood in his book, 2013 book, Truth Within. Flood says, or proves actually, that inwardness is found in all religious traditions. But his model, unfortunately, his model is focused on the higher order contents and cultural hermeneutics of the self, which builds itself around inwardness. So he places inwardness in context of culturally hermeneutical self, and that's how he analyzes it. So consequently, his analysis is distant from evidence as it gives itself, and on the contrary, it sort of exists on the other end of the spectrum, being broadly woven into this cultural hermeneutics of the self, and he ends up working with this cultural hermeneutics and not really given. But Mike Barber, in his 2017 book, and then the following 2018 article on representative mindset, identifies religion as province of being, which I think is pretty Husserlian, and Schutzer, of course, but Husserlian in its originality. So there are three defining parameters in this province of meaning, which stand out, at least in my analysis, as parts of this concept of religion as a province of meaning. Emancipatory relevances, reference to passive synthesis involving symbols, and then the representative mindset. Now, out of those three, emancipatory relevances will not be exclusive to the province of religious meaning, because science has emancipatory relevances, right? Philosophy is the project of emancipation. Likewise, presence of symbols or religious symbols is not cross-culturally necessary for the province of religious meaning, because there are quite a few of religious philosophies which are non-symbolic, or symbols may exist in them partially on a certain level of practice, but not necessarily as something pervasive to the theology involved. And of course, the most outstanding example of this will be Vedanta. Other non-iconographic tradition will be Dzogchen, a type of an aspect of Mahamudra Buddhism. So emancipatory relevances and passive synthesis involving symbols specifically, they are present, highly present in Christianity, but they don't, they are not purely dependent or strictly dependent parts of the province of religious meaning. And in reverse, the province of religious meaning will not be exclusively dependent on these features or parts. So they can't count as a foundation of the province of religious meaning, because they may or may not be in the province of religious meaning, as is the case with symbol, or they can extend onto the provinces of meaning which are other than the province of religious meaning. But the representative mindset, this is my favorite. And so It's favorite because it is invariably present in any religion, in any religious tradition. And because you cannot really take it out of province of religious meaning without it losing its wholeness or defining features. So what we have here then is the representative mindset as a candidate for foundation of for being a foundation of the province of religious meaning if we take a mereological approach. Now, inwardness in its hermeneutics always goes into the very same parameter that the representative mindset. That is, that in cases of inwardness, inwardness is always embodied. I mean, when the ego turns away from the world and towards the self, it has several options. It can go into the strata of pure self-reflection within the horizon of intentionality. That would be introspection. The ego can undertake phenomenological reflection, but it will still stay within the strata of intentionality. But what happens in case of religions very often is, actually always I think, is that the ego tries to cut through intentionality, that very unreal intentionality which masks the flesh, and tries to end up inside this immediately perceived, felt, lived flesh, and tries to look into this flesh in search of the truth within. So that brings us very close to the notion of representative mindset, because this is the mindset which uncovers or makes the ego oriented towards diving into the sphere of passive synthesis, towards focusing on passive synthesis. And flesh is the seat of passive synthesis in the embodied self. So we have a situation where two concepts, the concept of inwardness in flood and concept of the representative mindset in Barber, they connect around the concept of embodiment. So what you have empirically then in religion, attention is directed inward and toward the flesh. And this is followed by relocations of the ego pole, that this famous movement from the head to the heart, which is so emphasized by so many traditions, is basically the relocation, not yet relocalization, but relocation of the ego pole, essentially. But then phenomenologically, in embodied inwardness, the relaxation of the ego that, again, Barbara is writing about, brings out of anonymity passive synthesis involving flesh. And interestingly, because this is living body, which can be subject and can be object, relocations in this case turn into relocalizations. And I'm emphasizing it because in Martin Nietzsche's work on topological phenomenology, he makes a special kind of caveat explaining that relocalizations, topological relocalizations of the ego within the constitutive field are not the actual relocations in the real space. But in case of embodiment, because of the reversibility of the body, I think that the two come pretty close. So there is a puzzle which emerges out of these investigations of embodied inwardness. And that puzzle is, why would embodied inwardness also inspire intuitions related to microphysics. So yes, we go inward in search of the source of life, the truth within. This is often accompanied by religious experience of sorts, and sometimes this experience is symbolic, sometimes it isn't, sometimes it's purely affective. But why would the same sphere of experience inspire intuitions of microphysical realities in theoretical physicists? So we need to look into phenomenology of absorption and phenomenology of embodied inwardness to understand these possible crossovers, it seems to me. So as I already mentioned, interpreting embodied inwardness is not easy because it requires personal familiarity with this kind of consciousness. But there are two levels of interpretation. First level of interpretation, okay, this is a type of experience. It's something which is given empirically, first person, second person, textual accounts. But there is also a possibility to approach it in formal phenomenological analysis as a region of consciousness. And in case of it being an experience, an objection can be brought up to the claims that I am making to centrality of this region to religious province of meaning. The objection can be, well, what if it is an experience of the world, religious experience which is turned towards the world, or religious experience which doesn't give one clearly that defined direction of inwardness. Well, just a religious experience, maybe mundane religious experience, but without emphasis on inwardness. So arguably, when we interpret inwardness as a region of consciousness, then it loses the limiting connotation of a particular experience, and it becomes just a sphere of consciousness which is necessarily present in constitution of religious experience, and that can be any religious experience, inward or outward, or just everything, experience of non-locality, totality, however one calls it, but it's a region of consciousness which specifically participates in constitution of religious experience. Here I give an example of description from Philokalia from 10th century Saint Simeon, the new theologian, who says this: search inside yourself with your intellect so as to find the place of the heart where all the powers of the soul reside. To start with, you will find their darkness and impenetrable density. Later, when you persist and practice this task day and night, you will find, as though miraculously, an unceasing joy. As soon as the intellect attains the place of the heart, at once it sees things of which it previously knew nothing. It sees the open space within the heart, and it beholds itself entirely luminous and full of discrimination. And then he goes on with already pretty specific examples, fighting against demons, various manifestations of unconscious, using the prayer of the heart, but a saying goes, sit in yourself and it will teach you everything. So what he shows is that this absorption has stages. Initially, it's big, black, nothing. You cannot go anywhere. But gradually, there are some things rising. And in Orthodox Christianity, it turns into the concept of the inner man. And here is the mother of the sign showing this inner man in her chest. But then there is a description of a 4th century monastics, Theophanes the monk, who again describes this process of absorption. And there are very many stages. It's all layered. It's rather structured, but here is how it goes in this tradition. The first step is that of purest prayer. From this, there comes warmth of heart, and then a strange holy energy. Then tears run from the heart, God-given, then peace from thoughts of every kind. From this arises purging of the intellect, and next the vision of heavenly mystery. Unheard of light is born from this ineffably, and thence beyond all telling, the heart's illumination. Last comes a step that has no limit, though compassed in a single line, perfection that is endless. So I did textual and phenomenological analysis and historical analysis of this piece. So the analysis is published, and I don't think that we should stay more on this because I want to compare it with something which comes from a different tradition. It's the tradition of Kashmiri Shaivism Tantra, where one finds the following instruction: the yogi should contemplate over the skin part in his body like an outer inconscient wall, so inside. He whose mind with other senses is merged in the interior space of the heart. And what they mean by the heart, it's actually the interiority of the self. But look at this picture. There are all these chakra depictions, and they're extremely symbolically complex. And each part of these lotuses means something. It refers to a whole cluster of experiences which are remarkably fixed in the topography and geography of this interiority. And so, but what we have here, whether it will be a Christian version of things, or Vedanti, or Kashmiri Shaiva version of things, or any other version of things in the interiority, we have that the real world is now left out, so that there is a radical negation of external perception in a very Brentanian way. We're getting the interior consciousness, and that interior consciousness is embodied consciousness. Then there is the dark presentation of flesh, which gradually sprouts with densities and lights, which then interpretively they arrange into this or that variation of the subtle body or interiority. And then the question is, okay, so how is this invisible flesh, which is invisible in principle, how can it be presented? And that's where I think the most interesting part comes in, because there are other types of perception naturalistically now, sensory perception, which are called haptic and interoception. So haptic perception is tactility, which is read from within the interior space of the body. That very space inside the skin is filled by regular naturalistic flesh, and that flesh, through the sense of touch, it cannot fully give the presentation of it like sensory presentations, but it delivers some signals from interior organs. That's haptic. But then the interoception is even more interesting than that. It's a multisensory modality which piles together all the sensory input from outside and from inside. So it's merged with haptic perception. And then the ego, I don't know what kind of ego will it be, because this data are basically natural scientific, but some kind of observer, hypothetically, or actually sorts out of this full sensory data, sorts out what's external, what's internal. And that's how ego creates the spheres of internal and external, or psychic and physical. But what's interesting then is that the embodied inwardness, this darkness of flesh, which is invariably cognized within the provinces of religious meaning, or participates in constitution, has external within its internal. So it's like the part of us inside collects the signals from the world. And so what appears eventually as these vague luminosities and vague densities in the internal space has a combination of what is collected from the body and in this constitutional flesh becomes unreal, invisible flesh, but it's still a little bit visible because the ego turns towards the passive synthesis and chases out some material. But also it has the input from the exterior world, the input which did not go into constitution of the picture of the world. What wasn't utilized in the constitution of the world horizon will transpire somehow in the interiority of the body, in this inwardness. So, and what appears there, besides, chakras and meridians and other strange things, there is also the constitution of odd time and space. And what's also interesting in this constitution, that space, which in externality is defined basically by distances between the objects, inside appears as such. Like in this tantric description, yogi meditates on the interior space, and that space is merely pictorial. So it's this is the pictorial expression of an abstracted space. And that space is filled with the darkness of flesh, but it also acquires dimension of depth. And this is not the Merleau-Pontian perspectival depth, it's the depth of absorption. So in the inwardness, one enters sort of like internal cosmos. And we have this, universe which can be actually quite aesthetic. And I remember one of my interlocutors in gaining this material, she told me, I didn't know that I am so beautiful inside, because she goes inside and there are all these lights and densities and the whole cosmos, which is completely perfect and aesthetic. Okay, so, but now I think that it's important that we try to distinguish this area as the region of consciousness, because the relationships between the ego and its objects, that the objects that it picks up on in this interiority, they are different. There is the sharp distinctions between the subject and the object that we experience in ordinary external consciousness are not so pronounced there. As Nietzsche emphasized in his reading of transitive topological phenomenology, topological relocalizations of the ego within the scaffolding of consciousness are not identical with the moves in the real space. However, the same will be true in reverse unless the real moves take the form of relocations of the center of perception, the ego pole, within the space of the body. I already said it, but I'll reroute it again. The body differs from all other contents of the real space by reversibility between being the object and being the subject of consciousness. Thus, relocations of the ego pole within the body take place both in the real space and in the topological space of consciousness. So consciousness of embodied inwardness is accessed by absorption in the body itself. A move that also includes reduction and interruption of the outward going consciousness. Consciousness of inwardness de facto is the zone of consciousness, not some real cavity inside the body, even though the real cavity inside the chest facilitates absorption, and in religious tradition, the chest is featured as the entry into this inner space. Thus, the relocations of the ego into the body and towards the flesh are revealed to be the topological relocalization of the ego towards passive synthesis involving flesh. So the passive synthesis involving flesh, which are normally totally out of consciousness, in this inferiority, they're kind of leaking a little bit into the sphere of awareness. So Merleau-Ponty famously said that the ego is always looking from above. So it relocates, and then it stops looking from above, and then flesh and the inner space of the body become the objects of intentionality, but they are of course not true objects because there is no such a thing as flesh. And again, what we are perceiving as this flesh inside is the combination of some input from the environment and the input from the physical body. So, but as the result, what happens in this relocalizations already, okay, the ego splits into the observer and observed. There is no real world noema, so the ego is striving to get something new. And then it starts partially kind of identifying with these elements of the passive synthesis, and then in the reversal mode of intentionality presenting it to itself. So there is an ego split in this. So the options for the ego and embodied inwardness as follows: having sensuous, self-affective flesh for an attempted object of cognition gives the ego the following options. It can immerse itself in flesh, becoming totally receptive. It can also dance on the edge of flesh, being absorbed and coming out of absorption in a continuous split into observing and passive aspects. And it even can incorporate the aspects of flesh into its habitualities, thus resulting in the ego's normally ideal meanings felt as embodied. So these options open up on account of the fluid connectivity between the intentionality of consciousness and the sensibility of flesh revealed in this spectacle. And so over time, the self in embodied inwardness acquires limitlessness and non-locality, and psychic hierarchies in the body appear as infused by flesh, the pregnant whole of the self whose unity appears, that is perceived on the gradual spectrum of connectivity between the ego and its intentional object of flesh, which is primary non-object. As is well known, most of tradition attribute to such perception a spiritual value. Okay, so there is a lengthy argument that I bring in, and I'll summarize it shortly without reading the slide, which is based on your concept of transitivity, actually. But so Martin Nietzsche interprets Husserlian transitivity as a transition or the series of chronological transitions between acts of consciousness. But here, flesh becomes a participant in transitivity, and there is another type of transitivity which emerges between the ego and the flesh. The argument in this sphere is a little bit weak yet, because one has to appeal to qualitative aspects of flesh and qualitative aspects of intentionality, and argue that intentionality and sensibility are basically qualitative relatives. However, in Deleuze, senses have intentionality. Senses are intentional unities. So it won't be that radical to introduce this idea within phenomenology, but if, for example, this is presented in analytic philosophy, there will be big debates around that issue, whether we can connect the two. But I'll give you an example of reversibility, which is observed in the inner space. This is from Ibn Arabi, the Andalusian mystic of 12th century. Would that it's the area where there was a remarkable dialogue going on between Jewish mystics and Muslim mystics and Christian mystics, something that we profoundly lost, and unfortunately. But anyway, here is what Ibn Arabi says: would that I were aware whether they knew what heart they possessed. They here are ideas, ideal concepts, and the heart is embodied space of the chest. And would that my heart knew what mountain path they threaded, So there are ideas which are presented in the inner space of the heart, and then the ego, which observes these ideas, both forms and content, as embodied. And then he says, those who deem them safe or those who deem them dead, lovers lose their way in love and become entangled. So that's not how we perceive ideas usually, right? Ideas appear, ideas are superimposed on the body, there is no entanglement, but there are reversals in the inner space. All these reversals between observer and observed, between the ego and the flesh, between bestowed and intuitive meanings, stem from the single and essential reversals, a reversal within the essence of cognition. That's how Ibn Arabi writes about it. Is it not enough for him, for the contemplating mystic, that I am in his heart and that he beholds me at every moment? Is it not enough? This is in reference to concept of wisdom or salma, which is very difficult to identify. Sometimes it's pure awareness, but gosh, what is this pure awareness? Some kind of sensibility, right? So flesh provides the ego with options for perception found neither in the world horizon nor in the sphere of mental objects. Partly such options are reversals between the subject and the object in the religious experiences of the kind, I am him, but without me. He is the only one remaining in pare. I am the only one remaining in datatreya. I decrease, but he increases in Callistus where, but that's from New Testament. And thou art not him, and yet thou art him in Arabic. So briefly about psychic hierarchies. Normatively, mental contents do not have locations in the body schema. Husserl maintains that the spatial body is in possession of the psychic hierarchies by species of annexation. But who knows what is the species of annexation really? Thoughts in the head and feelings in the heart appear, according to Husserl, by body annexing meaning without explanation. What, how? The higher levels of the psychic hierarchies are never mapped onto the body. Here is Husserl psychological phenomenological psychology. All higher mentality comes to be experienced as animating this physical body only mediately. The psychic is not extensional in itself, but acquires secondary participation in extensionality and locality only by a physical body. This normative picture of consciousness, however, is very different from how things appear in embodied inwardness. Just a few examples. Indian Sufi Latayef system ties configurations of the self to the locations in the chest. The chakra system does the same with regard to the segments of the body schema. That very Kashmir Tantra Vijnana Bhairava that I already quoted gives instructions to meditate in certain points around the body and in the body where one can observe thoughts emerging from flesh. So then there is a layering of the mind in internality. Then there are, of course, psychologies built on the specific layering of the mind, like in Vedanta Sara or Harvard. These are different branches of Hinduism. There are characteristics of the layers of the mind, etc. And this all refers to the emergence of concepts and mapping of certain clusters of concepts onto the body schema perceived from within. But again, this can be experiences or this can be constitutive elements in the province of meaning, dependent on whether we look at it empirically or phenomenologically. But then there is another interesting thing which happens. What is this truth within? It's an experience of a great degree of certainty. It's in a sense, an experience of absolute certainty that people are looking for. And the previous speaker said that, oh no, that was Giulio Marchigiani, actually, whose talk was, I thought, excellent. He argues that there is no possibility of fulfillment. But I think that there is a possibility of fulfillment. It's not just a fulfillment, it's just not a fulfillment by the primary object. So when absorption dissolves the body boundaries, it reaches the fully open space of self-affective presence with no psychic content. So you have this absolute ontological homogeneity within, where flesh, which is boundless, appears as a single self-luminous block of matter light. So that's one of the impressions of in absorption. So when one is reaching that junction, this experience has a very strong grip. And then appearance of flesh mimics the idea of totality, which according to Husserl, we associate with the concept of God. So you have this ego grasping onto this homogeneous flesh light internally, and then there arises the binding of the idea of truth. So you have the truth within, but it's grasping at the flesh, whether God or transcendental absolute participates in it. Probably there is something, but we don't know anything about it. What we do know about that there is the possibility of fulfillment of this intention in absorption, just simply by the presence of flesh. This experience is describable. It's also can be intersubjective internally, because there remains freedom of epoche, which helps to recognize components of this experience. So one can study it, one can describe it. Okay, so I think I'll skip a couple of slides and then just go to the last slide, which talks about possibility of this quantum physics related ideas emerging from the side. So on one hand, one can just simply argue, well, it's a regressive consciousness. It gives you this semi-falling apart time and space inside, and this half decomposed time and space is what is perceived as isomorphic to quantum mechanics concepts such as reversal of the time, arrow, entanglement. Actually, I did comparative analysis in great detail, and there are transitions between states. There is mimicking of quantum concept of decoherence, entanglement, and other interesting concepts, which, time permitting, we should be able to actually describe in detail and analyze in detail. But there is another possibility, which I think is far more exciting here. This isomorphisms with quantum mechanics, they do have a ground to be more realistically interpreted. And that is, remember, there is interoception, there is this integrative sensory mobility. So well, we can fantasize or speculate that, let's say there is this ego which separates the external from internal, but it still has to take in some aspects of the external. So if I view this ego, what I would admit inside is that which I could not utilize in constitution of the external world, because otherwise it will be crazy. And people, when they go insane, they do confuse outside and inside. But here in this situation, it actually happens that the quantum concepts are connected to the situations when macro objects stop behaving like macro objects, and they sort of go on a tangent of suddenly behaving as microphysical entities. So that instances actually led to the discovery of quantum mechanics. So there is a possibility of some kind of intuition which taps into this decoherences in the life world, in the usual world, and channels this information into the interiority on some kind of pre-conscious maybe level. So then we have a possibility of intuiting these deliveries, maybe in the passive synthesis, possible. So Husserl famously calls passive synthesis the earth ground of the world horizon. And the syntheses, they have a capacity, not just synthesis, but synthesis of similarity, uniformity, concretion, and fusion as models of homogeneity, contrast and discretion, prominence as modes of heterogeneity and gradation. So that is the foundation of transcendental logic. So when we talk about the probabilities of quantum mechanics, which is completely non-logical, they may be also coming from the same fertile ground of passive synthesis, but this passive synthesis is not in regard to the external world, but in regard to this interiority. And then, I'm blanking out. I wanted to make one more conclusive statement, but I don't remember what that was. I'll probably remember, but afterwards. But basically we have I remembered. Okay, so we have the state of pure flesh in absorption, which is appearing as this luminous substrate with the connotations of truth, possibly with religious connotations. But it also, the same experience can serve as a ground for the intuition of quantum concepts. There needs to be the homogeneity of presented flesh for either religious experience or insight into quantum mechanics to arise, because odd time and space, they start ticking in, showing up when the experience inside becomes absorptively homogeneous. So flesh then serves as this kind of a junction, perceptual junction, which can switch the mind to the road of religious perception and vertical transcendence, or it can switch the mind to horizontal transcendence, but not towards the visible, towards normally visible. So that's all I had to say. Yeah. Oh, yeah, please.
Want me to?
Or why don't you?
Okay.
Yeah. I'd rather stay back.
Two small points, I think. So one is, I think, something I hope will be helpful for you in terms of the argument you didn't get to, but you were sort of alluding to about the relationship between sensibility and intentionality.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Deleuze as someone who ties these together. But I think also there's resources in phenomenology to do. Merleau-Ponty also, I think, signs them together, brings them
In
close.
which work?
Especially Invisible and the Invisible. And Remy Quant has a little book called Phenomenology of Expression, published by Duquesne. I saw it in that over there. And he talks in there a little bit about, there's some quotes in there, and we can talk later.
Well, you know this, but let me resonate. I think that the argument, whenever one goes to qualitative aspect, the argument weakens, because you cannot, you cannot build much logic, justificatory logic out of that. But thank you for the references.
And I think in Husserl as well, his notion of sensing, so empfindliche, I think is also, right, even in the word itself, the combination of Empfindung and Erlebnisse is already a combination of sensation and something like, something like, I mean, lived experience is not quite, intentionality, but of course there's a close relation to those for Husserl.
Yeah, okay.
My other question / comment for you is this one is more of a question. I wonder, in terms of the relationship with quantum physics that you're talking about, and how can we bring those together? I wonder if you find the language. I'll use the language of connectedness, like with reality or something like that. If that is helpful causal explanation here, right? Because I think a lot of the things, right, with the internal awareness of inwardness and stuff, there's a looking for connectedness of the ego with reality, and ultimately you talk about the absorption and the loss of ego, right? But that connection with reality, and I wonder if something similar is at work in quantum physics, if that can be a point of connection.
The difficulty here, yes, I do, thank you, and I do talk in terms of connectivity, but quantum physics is totally illogical. It's not logical. the rule of the, what is it, excluded middle or whatever they are, the logical
Yeah.
rules, they just fail there. It's absolutely nonsensical from the standpoint of the mind. And as a result, they emerge weird theories that quantum physics, the enterprise of quantum physics, that's what Paul spoke of yesterday, is in itself just a desperate attempt of the mind to try to come to coherence with itself so that it doesn't go crazy. So I think that what religious experience actually gives us is the possibility of positive kinds of intuition which make quantum physics accessible for reason, even though this reason is not logical. Because these are non-objects that the ego is grasping at in this case. So, yeah.
I was going to ask a different question, but this is really interesting, so I'll stick with this. It makes me wonder, though, the quantum physical conversation is not really breachable by Husserlian language because they don't speak it and won't hear of it. So I wonder, and this gets back to Michael's comments on the provinces of meaning, if they're incommensurable.
If I may correct the premise, there was a quantum physicist called London who was a student of Husserl. London and Bauer, who wasn't a student of Husserl, developed the concept of observer consciousness in quantum mechanics, which is Husserlian. Then there is a contemporary researcher, French, who updates this argument. And he published just lately the book, and there is actually a big discussion. Then there is also Phenomenology of quantum mechanics, which is descriptive, but nevertheless. So we don't know this literature because we dwell in a different domain. But it's possible, it seems, to use Husserl's phenomenology to knock down Kantian limits of the mind through the analysis of evidence in religious experience. And it's also possible to use Husserl's phenomenology to reconstruct cognition for quantum mechanics. So these are people, there is a group of people who are working on this actually at the University of Graz. And I was trying to seduce Martin with his Department of Philosophy in Prague to go in that direction and kind of...
With Sonia. With Sonia? I'm working with Sonia.
With Sonia, well, Sonia less maybe, but Philippe Berghofer very much actively. And then there are other physicists who are connected with him. And one of them I'm in touch with, actually French. But for us to engage with that area as a society, that would be absolutely breathtaking, except for we need to do much more of the comparative work on these concepts. And, you know, there is quantum conceptualism, so it's done for cognitive psychology, but it's not done really for phenomenology, religious experience. And Michel Bitbol will be the only probably theoretical physicist who was welcoming enough to show up and say something. But
I might say that's very encouraging. I was not aware of that interface.
I'll be happy to send you French.
It's very encouraging because in the history of quantum theory since the 1920s, people like John von Neumann and David Bohm, who had more phenomenological thoughts about quantum phenomena, they were ostracized.
But Niels Bohr,
Sure.
yes.
He's dead.
Yes,
So that
yes,
makes a
he's dead, but
difference.
before he died, he
Right.
came up with a concept of transcendental physics. And he said that sharp distinctions between subject and object, which we uphold in our usual perception and thinking, should be revisioned because that's not what they observe in experiments. And when he means subject, he doesn't mean subject meaning subjectivity, but means the measuring apparatus. But it nevertheless, it points out to the same kind of relationship which interior appear in phenomenology. Yeah. So Niels Bohr is my man.
I see Jeff out there, don't, Jeff, are you,
Jeff, are we done?
it's 4, well, it's after 4. Are we done?
Yeah.
It can be done.
Game over. Thanks, Olga.